yıllık edenler.
The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, is world-renowned as a research institution specializing in engineering and the physical sciences. It may therefore come as somewhat of a surprise that on the east side of campus, in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy, a committed group of theoretical linguists has begun the study of Zazaca. The department, founded in 1961 by Morris Halley and Noam Chomsky, has set the pace for much of the intellectual work that has subsequently made linguistics a strong and lively branch of the cognitive sciences. Today, with over 40 PhD students in the graduate program, the department maintains its focus on the continued importance of approaches to the discovery of both mental and cultural universals and contrasts. Part of the graduate training includes topics in the grammar of a less familiar language, a course initiated by Professor Kenneth Hale. On February 6, 2003, 9 MIT graduate students, led by Professors Michael Kenstowitz, a phonologist, and Norvin Richards, a syntactician, began their study of the relatively underdocumented Zazaca language. Zazaca can be classified as an endangered language as it is being spoken less and less by younger generations. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Zazaca has been accepted as a language of its own among linguists and not any longer merely as a Kurdi or Kurdish dialect. Nevertheless, until recently, the Zaza people were generally held to be Kurds, speaking a special dialect of Kurdi. Due to the oppressive minority and language policy of the Republic of Turkey, until 15 years ago there existed practically no indigenous Zazaca written literature, and so no means by which the Zaza people could find out anything about their own language and cultural identity. We interviewed Noam Chomsky on globalization and its effects on endangered languages.
Well, it's a complicated issue. First of all, when we talk about endangered languages, people usually have in mind third world languages or fourth world languages. They don't have in mind the languages of, say, Europe. But the languages of Europe are severely endangered. In fact, have been disappearing at a very rapid rate. It's an early stage of what's now called globalization. I mean, with the formation of national states in Europe and the integration of the European societies, right within the most advanced region of Western civilization, there's been a very rapid decline of languages. So plenty of people can't talk to their grandmothers now because the languages have just disappeared. In fact, one of the major research programs in linguistics today is a European Union program studying disappearing languages in Europe. They're called dialects, but they're just different languages. And on the other hand, and this bears on globalization, the integration of Europe and the kind of move towards centralization and so on has set up a counter-reaction. So an increasing regionalization, and a lot of the regional languages are being revived with a good deal of commitment and intensity. And it's, so in Spain, for example, Catalan is much more lively than, under Franco it was suppressed. You know, you walked in the streets of Barcelona, you never heard it. But now it's the language of Catalonia, you know. The Basque language has been revived considerably. Other so-called dialects like Asturian and others are also becoming, people always spoke them, but now they're speaking them self-consciously and interested in reviving them in the culture and so on. And it's happening elsewhere too. You walk in the streets of Wales and school children are speaking Welsh. There is a reaction to the centralization and integration which is leading to revival of regional identities, local cultures, practices, folk songs, language, and so on. And I suspect we're seeing it's harder worldwide. This is a rich, privileged area, so lots of things can happen that aren't going to happen in the American Southwest or, Aboriginal Australia. But still, I think something similar can be found. So the general process is one of leveling and destruction. On the other hand, the human beings are complicated creatures. They also struggle for their own rights, so you get counter-reactions.
Beyond the political importance of studying Zazaci, theoretical linguists can benefit from the study of an underdocumented language.
We are trying to put together a puzzle that has been scattered across all the languages of the world, that every language that we look at has something to contribute to our theoretical understanding of how human languages are put together. So I've been working with you on how questions are put together in Zazaci, and that's helped me to understand better how questions are put together more generally. There are things I understand better, for example, about a language from the Philippines that I work with, Tagalog, because of the things that you've taught me about how Zazaci works. So there are those kinds of connections. It's also important, I think, for the community who speak Zazaci themselves to understand that the language is a valuable and an important language, that it's got properties that are of great importance and interest to theoretical linguists.
The nature of the course then is to allow our students to put into practice some of the theory that they've learned in describing a language that's unfamiliar to them. And Zazaci is particularly interesting then, and it's an Indo-European language. As you know, many Indo-European languages have been very well studied, but there are some that have not, and your language is one of them.
The class was conducted once a week for 14 weeks, supplemented by additional individual meetings between each student and Guljem Akhtaj, the class's Zazaci consultant.
Interesting effects with vowel changes that we talked about a lot in the class so far.
We found that there are at least two different types of this construction, which is kind of surprising because it would affect, and they show some kind of behavior which is also unexpected at first sight. So I'm trying to see exactly how these groups pattern together and try to give an account for.
Each graduate student spent the course of the semester writing a research paper on a particular topic in Zazaci grammar.
So I'm working on how Zazaci speakers mark the source of information they have for the claims that they make in their sentences. And I found it interesting because it's done in a very different way.
I'm interested in finding out what happens to words and other linguistic things when they're taken into Zazaci and made Zazaci. How do they change, and how do Zazaci speakers change them?
But I've been looking at our causatives, the way you say that somebody made someone do something, and I like that. I think that's really interesting.
Quite a few interesting phenomena which we are only beginning to understand. Things like, I'm sure people have already talked about evidentials, also the as-if construction. In linguistics, be it formal linguistics or any other kind, we're still really just beginning to get a grasp of how those kinds of structures work. And Zaza is a great language for exploring that. It's really important.
One of my main interests is in a lot of different languages is the way that questions are formed. Zazaci has a way of forming questions that allows you to either do nothing, leave a question word in situ, which is something we find in a bunch of different languages, or to move it to the front of the sentence by a variety of means. So you can ask questions like, so you can take a statement like "Es que tal dato," and you can change that to a question like "Do que tal da kamjichineke," or you can make that into a question by taking kamjichineke and moving it to the front. So like "Kamjichineka ku do que tal da." That sort of optionality in that way of having a choice between two different ways of forming questions, that in itself is interesting. And the conditions on when you can use which of those types of questions, that's interesting as well. So there are a lot of very sort of complicated facts about the way questions are formed that are useful toward our understanding of human language more generally.
I didn't know that much about Kurdish society. I'd known about the Kurdish diaspora and so forth, and the fragmentation of the Kurdish nation across a bunch of national boundaries, but that was about it. I had never met, until I met you, until I met our interviewer, I had never met a Kurdish person ever.
After we started our work in the linguistics department on Zazaci, we decided to see how it might benefit other people in the MIT community and what the sort of general level of understanding and knowledge was about Zazaci and Kurdish language quite generally. So we decided to spend the afternoon polling random MIT students about what they know, and here's what we found.
I study mechanical engineering and electrical engineering.
Okay, we have an engineer here. Do you know what Zazaca is?
Zazaca. Not without any context.
No, okay.
No.
Any guesses or?
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay, what if I told you, which is actually true, that Zazaca is a language? Where do you think it might be spoken?
It's tough. I would guess possibly Central or South America, or possibly Africa, maybe, somewhere in the Pacific Islands, but I don't know.
I wanted to ask you if you knew what Zazaca is.
Sorry, no.
Now, Zazaca is a language. Where do you think it's spoken?
Africa?
Africa. It turns out to be spoken by Kurds. So what language would that make it most closely related to?
I have no idea.
Have you ever heard of a language called Zazaca?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Does it ring any bells? Do you have any guess where it might be spoken?
I assume I know most European languages, so I'm guessing it's not one of those. It might be one of the former Soviet ones. Might be an Asian, African, maybe it might be a Native American. I don't know. I have no guesses really.
Okay. It turns out Zazaca is spoken by Kurdish people.
Okay.
Now, do you have any guesses what languages Kurdish might be related to?
Arabic, or if there's a Turkish dialect, or Hindi possibly.
Zazaca? No, I don't know.
Just venture any guess. Zazaca.
It sounds foreign. I mean,
Yes.
It doesn't sound Western.
Yes. Well, what if I told you, and in fact it is, Zazaca is a language. Zazaca is a language. Where is it spoken?
Must be in some Middle Eastern tribe.
Middle East. Very good. Very close.
Sounds Indian.
It sounds Japanese. I have no idea.
Sounds Indian to you, Japanese to you. Now, if I told you that Zazaca was a language, where would you think it's spoken? Zazaca is a West Iranian language spoken in southeast Anatolia, northwest to the Kurdi or Kurdish-speaking regions. Estimates of the number of speakers vary from 1 to 2.5 million people. The major cities where Zazaca is spoken include Diyarbakir, Darsim, Mush, Elaziz, and Bingul on the upper courses of the Euphrates, Kızılırmak, and Murat rivers. In considering Zazaca, we may raise the question, what is the difference between a language and a dialect?
That's a very difficult question. Sort of in layman's terms, it would be that two varieties of the same language that are more or less mutually intelligible to one another. Structurally, it's very difficult to give a definition.
One thing that linguists often say about dialects versus languages, which you asked about earlier, is that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And that just goes to show that, again, it's more a matter of how people think of languages and what kind of social uses they have that determines whether we call it a language versus a dialect.
A lot of linguists think that there actually are no such things as either languages or dialects. We have this tendency to define things as languages or dialects based on political criteria. So we call things dialects if they are close together and both within a single country, and we call them languages if they are in different countries. Those aren't the kinds of criteria that linguists are interested in, so there are no linguistic criteria that allow you to say these two things are dialects or these two things are languages. So for example, we customarily talk about the ways people speak in China, the Cantonese and Mandarin, for example. We talk about those and we call them dialects because they are both spoken in China, but they're no more similar to each other than Spanish and French. I mean, they're related, but they're not mutually intelligible. There's no real reason to call them dialects instead of languages. We call Norwegian and Swedish different languages because they're spoken in different countries, but they are mutually intelligible. Someone who only speaks Norwegian, someone who only speaks Swedish or Danish, they can understand each other. So it's not clear that there is a good definition.